It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in Clearwater. A quiet suburban town where the hum of lawnmowers often mingled with the distant laughter of children. Life moved slowly here, like a river unhurried by time. On any given day, the streets were lined with neatly trimmed hedges and mailboxes painted in cheerful colors. Each one marking a home where neighbors knew each other's names, faces, and histories. Maya Harris, just 10 years old, walked home from school the same way she always did. Her backpack bounced lightly on her shoulders as she hummed a tune from music class. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, and the occasional rustle of leaves accompanied her steps. There was nothing unusual about the day. At least not for Maya. She had no reason to expect anything but the comforting monotony of her routine. That was until the sound of sirens broke through the stillness, their sharp wail slicing the air. A police cruiser rounded the corner, its lights casting red and blue flashes against the tidy facades of the homes. Maya froze, her humming silenced mid-note. It wasn't fear at first, just confusion. Clearwater was the kind of town where police cars were usually seen parked outside the coffee shop, their occupants chatting casually with locals. She wondered briefly who or what could have caused such urgency. The cruiser slowed and came to a deliberate stop beside her. Maya looked up, her wide eyes meeting the stern gaze of Officer Thompson. She recognized him, of course. Everyone in Clearwater knew Officer Thompson. Not through personal acquaintance but through stories whispered at barbecues and book clubs. Stories of a man whose badge seemed heavier than most, whose judgment fell quicker than his understanding. "Hey, you there," he barked, his voice startlingly sharp in the quiet. Maya blinked, unsure if he was speaking to her. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting someone else to appear. But there was no one else on the street. Just her. "What are you doing around here?" he asked, stepping out of the car. His boots hit the pavement with a dull thud, and the sound seemed to echo. Maya opened her mouth, but the words didn't come. What was she doing? She was walking home, nothing more, nothing less. It was what she had done every day for years. "I live here," she finally managed, her voice small. The officer's eyes narrowed as if the simple answer wasn't enough. "Where are your parents?" he asked, his tone sharper now. "At home," she replied, her voice trembling. "I'm just walking home from school." But Officer Thompson didn't soften. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence suddenly looming. His hand moved toward his belt, where a pair of handcuffs glinted in the sunlight. "You think you can just wander around here without anyone noticing?" he said, his voice low, almost a growl. Maya's breath caught in her throat. Wander? It wasn't a word she'd ever associated with herself. She wasn't lost, wasn't doing anything unusual. She was just a child walking home. The officer's words, however, seemed to carry an accusation she didn't understand but instinctively felt the weight of. "You're coming with me," he said flatly. The world around her slowed. The houses, the trees, the familiar sidewalks, all of it blurred as her arms were pulled behind her. And the cold touch of metal encircled her small wrists. The cuffs pinched, not just her skin but her sense of safety, her trust in the world she thought she knew. Maya wanted to speak, to tell him he was making a mistake. But the knot in her throat wouldn't let her. The weight of the moment silenced her. And as she was guided toward the back seat of the cruiser, the once ordinary Tuesday became something she'd never forget. From behind curtains and porches, a few neighbors watched. Some shook their heads, their faces pinched with discomfort. Others turned away, their hands busying themselves with trivial tasks. A couple of phones emerged, their cameras capturing the scene in hushed silence. No one spoke, no one intervened. Maya sat in the cruiser, her wide eyes fixed on the world outside as it rolled past. She thought of her mother's voice reminding her every morning to be polite, to stay out of trouble, to make it home safely. But what could she have done differently today? She had followed every rule, obeyed every unspoken law of childhood. And still, she was here, in Clearwater. The shadows were long, that die, not just the ones cast by the setting sun but those that stretched across its people, across its streets, across its unspoken truths. The police station was not what Maya had imagined. For a 10-year-old girl, The very idea of such a place belonged more to television shows and whispered playground rumors than to her quiet life in Clearwater. Yet here she was, standing in the harsh glow of fluorescent lights. Her small frame dwarfed by the tall, gray walls. The air inside was heavy, thick with an unspoken tension that seemed to seep into the walls themselves. Officer Thompson's hand was firm on her arm as he guided her through the station. Each step echoed, a sharp reminder of how unfamiliar this world was to her. Maya's wrists still stung from the cuffs he had removed just moments ago, their weight replaced by an invisible ache that lingered. The hallway stretched endlessly in front of her, its floors cold and sterile. Occasionally, doors would open and close, revealing quick glimpses of the people inside. A man in a rumpled shirt, slumped in a chair, two officers in quiet conversation. None of them paid any attention to Maya. To them, she was just another presence passing through, too small and too young to draw their concern. Officer Thompson said nothing. His face was a mask of practiced indifference, but his grip on her arm betrayed a certain impatience. He walked with the confidence of someone who had done this 100 times before. Yet there was something in his stride, a stiffness, a guardedness that suggested he knew not everyone would agree with what he had done. Maya's breath was shallow, her steps hesitant. She glanced at the rows of doors lining the hallway, each one identical, each one holding stories she didn't want to imagine. Her thoughts swirled, caught between fear and confusion. What had she done wrong? Why was she here? Finally, they reached a small room at the end of the hall. The door creaked as Officer Thompson pushed it open, revealing a stark interior. A metal table, two chairs, and a small window high on the wall that let in just enough light to make the space feel even colder. "Sit," he instructed, his voice clipped. Maya obeyed, her legs swinging slightly above the ground as she perched on the chair. She clasped her hands tightly in her lap, the marks from the handcuffs faintly visible against her skin. She stared at them, willing herself not to cry. The door clicked shut behind her, and for a moment, the silence in the room was complete. It pressed against her ears, heavy and suffocating. She thought about her mother, who must have been setting the table for dinner by now, wondering why Maya wasn't home. The thought made her chest tighten. The silence was broken by the sound of another door opening down the hall. Moments later, it swung open again, and a woman stepped into the room. She was older than Officer Thompson, with short, dark hair and a face that carried both weariness and authority. Her uniform was crisp, but her eyes were softer than Maya had expected. "I'm Officer Lopez," the woman said, her voice calm and even. She didn't sit down right away. Instead, she stood by the door for a moment, her gaze flicking between Maya and the file she held. Maya couldn't read her expression, but there was something about the way Officer Lopez looked at her, steady, assessing, but not unkind, that made Maya feel just a little less alone. "You're Maya Harris, right?" Lopez asked, finally taking a seat across from her. Maya nodded, her voice caught somewhere in her throat. Officer Lopez opened the file, scanning its contents briefly before closing it again. She folded her hands on the table and leaned forward slightly, her tone softening. "Maya," she began, "can you tell me what happened today?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Maya hesitated, unsure of what to say. The words felt too big, too tangled in her mind to come out in any kind of order. She wanted to tell Officer Lopez everything, that she hadn't done anything wrong, that she was just walking home, that none of this made any sense, but the knot in her chest wouldn't loosen. "I was just walking home," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "That's all." Officer Lopez didn't respond right away. She nodded slowly, her gaze steady on Maya's face, as if she were trying to piece together a puzzle. "Did Officer Thompson tell you why he stopped you?" Lopez asked. Maya shook her head, her hands tightening their grip on each other. "He just said I looked suspicious." Lopez's expression didn't change, but Maya noticed a subtle shift in her posture. She sat back slightly, her hands unfolding, as if weighing the weight of those words. "Looked suspicious. I see," Lopez said after a moment. Her tone measured. She glanced at the door, where Officer Thompson stood on the other side, his shadow faintly visible through the glass panel. He hadn't entered the room. but Maya could feel his presence like a heavy stone in her stomach. Listen, Maya, Lopez said, leaning forward again. I'm going to make sure we get to the bottom of this. But I need you to stay here for a little while longer. Can you do that? Maya nodded, though her chest tightened at the thought of being left alone in this strange, sterile place. Lopez gave her a small, reassuring smile and rose from her chair. As she walked to the door, Maya watched her closely, trying to decipher the kind of person she was. Before leaving, Lopez paused, turning to glance at Maya one last time. You didn't do anything wrong, she said quietly, almost as if to herself. Then she stepped out, the door clicking softly behind her. Maya sat there in the silence, her hands still clasped tightly in her lap. She didn't know what to think. Didn't know what to feel. The world she had thought she understood Clearwater. Her neighbors, the people in uniforms who were supposed to protect her suddenly felt unfamiliar and cold. Outside the room, voices rose and fell in heated discussion. Maya couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Tension. Disagreement. Something unspoken bubbling to the surface. It was a language she had never been taught but instinctively understood. And in that moment, Maya began to realize that this was bigger than her. Bigger than a single afternoon or a single mistake. This was something that had been simmering beneath the surface of Clearwater for a long time. Hidden in plain sight. And now, it was spilling into the open. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Maya sat in the small room, her feet swinging just above the floor, her eyes fixed on the scuffed metal table in front of her. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was heavy, filled with questions she didn't know how to ask and answers she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. From outside, the murmur of voices occasionally broke through the walls. Some sharp, some measured, but always muffled, as though the station itself was trying to keep its secrets. Maya wondered what they were talking about. If her name was part of the conversation. If anyone was on her side. The door finally opened, and Officer Lopez returned, her expression unreadable. Behind her, Officer Thompson loomed, his presence filling the doorway. His arms were crossed, his posture rigid, and his face was set in a look Maya had seen once before on the face of a neighbor's dog when it had been backed into a corner. Lopez moved to stand by the table, her eyes briefly meeting Maya's before turning to Thompson. The air in the room shifted. Subtle but undeniable. It was the kind of shift that happened when two people who shared a history found themselves at odds. Thompson, Lopez said, her voice calm but firm. We need to talk. Thompson didn't move. About what? He asked. Though the clipped edge to his words suggested he already knew. You know what? Lopez replied. Her tone was steady, like someone trying to coax a flame into a simmer. We've had complaints before. This isn't the first time something like this has come up. Maya's ears perked up at that. Complaints? She glanced at Thompson, whose jaw tightened, his gaze fixed somewhere just above Lopez's shoulder. This is different, Thompson said, his voice low. The kid was wandering around. Looked out of place. I followed protocol. Protocol, Lopez repeated, her brow lifting slightly. She folded her arms, mirroring his stance. Since when does walking home from school make a 10-year-old suspicious? Since when does following protocol mean cuffing a child without probable cause? Thompson didn't answer. His silence was louder than any argument he could have made. Maya shrank back in her chair, the conversation making her feel smaller, as though she had stumbled into a world she wasn't meant to see. But she listened closely, her young mind piecing together fragments of something bigger than the room they were in. Thompson, Lopez continued, her voice softening just slightly. I need you to step outside. We'll handle this from here. He hesitated, his eyes finally darting to Maya for the briefest of moments. It wasn't the kind of look that sought understanding or offered apology. It was a look that carried something else, a resentment. Maybe, or fear. Then, with a sharp exhale, he turned and walked out, the door clicking shut behind him. The room felt lighter without him, though the weight of what had just happened lingered like smoke after a fire. Lopez pulled out the chair across from Maya and sat down, her posture more relaxed now, but her face still serious. Maya, she began, her tone softer than before. I want you to know that what happened today shouldn't have happened. This isn't your fault. Maya stared at her, the words sounding almost foreign. She wanted to believe them. But the memory of Thompson's grip on her arm and the cold snap of the handcuffs around her wrists made it hard to shake the feeling that somehow, it was her fault. Am I in trouble? Maya asked quietly. Lopez's face softened, a small crease appearing between her brows. No, she said firmly. You're not in trouble. You didn't do anything wrong. Then why? Maya started but stopped herself, unsure how to finish the question. Why did this happen? Lopez offered gently. Maya nodded. Lopez let out a slow breath, leaning back slightly in her chair. For a moment, she seemed to be searching for the right words, as though trying to untangle something far more complicated than a 10-year-old could fully understand. Sometimes, Lopez said finally, people make decisions based on things they don't even realize they're doing. They see someone, and instead of asking questions or getting to know them, they make assumptions. And those assumptions, they can be wrong. Maya looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the faint marks left by the cuffs. Was it because of me? She asked, her voice so soft it was almost a whisper. Lopez hesitated. It wasn't you, she said, her voice gentle but firm. It was about what Officer Thompson thought when he saw you. And that's not fair. It's not right. The room fell quiet again. But this time the silence felt different, not as heavy, but still significant, as if the space between their words held something fragile and unspoken. Maya thought about Lopez's answer, about the idea that someone could look at her and see something she wasn't. It didn't make sense to her, but it felt true in a way that made her chest tighten. Lopez stood up, breaking the silence. I'm going to take you home, she said, her tone warm but decisive. Your mom's been worried about you. Maya nodded, relief washing over her like a warm blanket. She slid off the chair and followed Lopez to the door. As they stepped into the hallway, Maya couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, half expecting Thompson to be waiting there, his eyes full of that same quiet anger. But the hallway was empty, its walls lined with shadows. The ride home was quiet. Maya stared out the window, watching the streets of Clearwater blur past. The town looked the same as it always had: neat houses, trimmed lawns, the occasional dog trotting along the sidewalk. But something about it felt different now, as though the thin veneer of perfection had been cracked just enough for her to see what lay beneath. When they pulled into her driveway, Lopez turned to her, her gaze steady. You're going to be okay, Maya, she said, and if you ever need anything, you call me, all right? Maya nodded, her voice caught in her throat. She stepped out of the car, her legs feeling shaky beneath her, and walked up the path to her front door. Before she opened it, she turned back to see Lopez watching her, a quiet strength in her expression. Inside, the familiar smell of home greeted her, and her mother's voice called out from the kitchen. But even as she stepped into the warmth of her house, Maya knew that something had changed, not just in her, but in the way she saw the world. It wasn't as simple as she had once thought. And maybe it never had been. The next morning, Maya sat at the kitchen table, her legs dangling off the chair as she watched her mother prepare breakfast. The smell of scrambled eggs and toast filled the room. But Maya wasn't hungry. Her appetite had been replaced by a quiet unease that settled in her chest. Stubborn and unyielding, her mother moved with practiced ease. But her silence was telling. She hadn't said much since Maya came home the evening before, other than to hug her tightly and tell her she was safe now. This morning, though, her face was drawn, her usual warmth tempered by a worry she wasn't ready to voice. Mama, Maya said softly, breaking the silence. Why did the officer think I did something wrong? Her mother paused, her hand stilling on the frying pan. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint sizzle of eggs. She turned to Maya, her eyes soft but serious. Sometimes people don't see what's right in front of them, she said carefully. Sometimes they only see what they've been told to expect. Maya frowned, her young mind trying to untangle the meaning behind her mother's words. But I wasn't doing anything, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I know, baby, her mother said, sitting down across from her. She reached for Maya's hands, her fingers warm and steady. But the world doesn't always work the way it should. Sometimes people make mistakes. And sometimes those mistakes aren't really mistakes at all, they are choices. Maya nodded slowly, though her confusion lingered. She had heard her mother and her friends talk about things like this before. Always in hushed tones, as if speaking too loudly might invite trouble. Words like unfair and different rules had drifted in and out of conversations Maya was never meant to understand. But now, those words felt closer, sharper. Do you think you'll get in trouble? Maya asked after a long pause. Her mother hesitated. I don't know, she admitted. But what matters is that we tell the truth about what happened. People need to know. The thought of telling anyone else about what happened made Maya's stomach twist. She didn't want to relive the moment. Didn't want to feel the weight of those handcuffs or the cold metal of the squad car again. But her mother's words stayed with her. People need to know. Blank. Blank. Later that afternoon, Maya sat in her room, staring at the small stack of books on her desk. Normally, she would have been reading or drawing, her mind lost in her favorite worlds. But now, her thoughts refused to settle. They circled back to Officer Thompson, to the way he had looked at her not as Maya Harris, a girl who lived on Maple Street, but as someone else entirely. Her mother had made a few phone calls that morning, her voice calm but firm as she explained what had happened to the school principal. Miss Turner. Maya had overheard snippets of the conversation. No explanation. Completely unacceptable, and needs to be addressed. She didn't know what Miss Turner had said in response. But by the time her mother hung up, her shoulders seemed a little less tense. By early evening, the phone rang again. This time, her mother handed it to Maya. It's Miss Turner, she said, her tone encouraging. She wants to talk to you. Maya hesitated before taking the phone. Hello? Maya, this is Miss Turner, came the familiar voice. Your mother told me what happened yesterday. Are you all right? Maya nodded, then realized Miss Turner couldn't see her. Yes, she said quietly. That's good to hear, Miss Turner said, her tone gentle. Maya, I want you to know that what happened to you wasn't fair. It shouldn't have happened, and I'm so sorry you had to go through that. Maya didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. I'm going to talk to some people. Miss Turner continued. I want to make sure something like this doesn't happen again, not to you. Not to anyone. Okay, Maya said, though she wasn't entirely sure what that meant. The idea that adults could fix this, that they could make it so it never happened again, felt both comforting and impossibly far away. Blank. Blank. The next day at school, Maya felt the weight of her classmates' stares as she walked into the building. News traveled fast in Clearwater. Even among fourth graders, some kids whispered as she passed, their voices blending into an unintelligible hum. Others avoided her altogether, their eyes darting away when she looked at them. At recess, a boy named James approached her. He was taller than most of the other kids and always had something to say, whether it was welcome or not. Hey, Maya, he said, his tone somewhere between curious and accusatory. I heard a cop arrested you. What did you do? Maya stiffened, her hands curling into fists at her sides. Nothing, she said firmly. I didn't do anything. Then why did he arrest you? James pressed, his brow furrowing. Maya opened her mouth to answer but stopped. How could she explain something she didn't fully understand herself? How could she put into words the feeling of being seen as someone you weren't? Of being judged for something you didn't do? I don't know, she said finally, her voice quieter now. He just did. James stared at her for a moment longer before shrugging and walking away. But the questions he left behind lingered, heavier than the ones Maya had carried before. Blank. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Maya sat on the porch with her mother. The neighborhood was quiet, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the occasional bark of a dog in the distance. Maya leaned against her mother's side, her small frame fitting perfectly into the curve of her arm. Do you think people will believe me? Maya asked after a long silence. Her mother looked down at her, her expression both sad and resolute. The people who matter will, she said, and the ones who don't, well, they're not worth worrying about. Maya nodded, though her heart still felt heavy. She thought about the kids at school, about James's questions, About the way the world seemed to change depending on who you were and how people saw you. Clearwater hadn't changed overnight, and Maya doubted it ever would. But as she sat there, wrapped in her mother's quiet strength, she began to understand something she hadn't before. The world might not always be fair. But that didn't mean she couldn't be. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start something new. Clearwater had always been a town where life moved quietly, like a river untroubled by storms. People waved politely to one another from their front porches, exchanged pleasantries at the grocery store, and prided themselves on a sense of shared community. Yet, beneath that surface, there were currents few talked about and spoken divides that were easy to overlook until they couldn't be anymore. Maya's story was one of those moments that broke the calm. By the end of the week, nearly everyone in town had heard about what had happened. Some learned through whispered conversations at the diner. Others through Facebook posts that traveled faster than the morning paper. A few even claimed they had seen it firsthand, though their versions of the story varied in ways that said more about them than about Maya. She must have done something. One man said over coffee at the local cafe. Cops don't just arrest kids for no reason. She's just a little girl. Someone else replied, their voice carrying a quiet frustration. Why would they treat her like that? The tension grew slowly, almost imperceptibly, as people began to pick sides, not openly, of course, but in the way they talked. In the way they avoided eye contact when passing each other on the street. It was the kind of divide Clearwater rarely acknowledged. The kind that had always been there but now seemed impossible to ignore. Blank. Blank. Maya felt the shift too, even if she couldn't fully understand it. At school, the whispers hadn't stopped. Teachers were kinder than usual. Their voices softer, their smiles a little too practiced. But their concern only made the questions from her classmates sting more. Why would the police stop you? One girl asked during lunch. Were you in the wrong place? No, Maya replied, her voice firm even though her hands shook slightly. I was just walking home. But why you? The girl pressed. Her brow furrowed as if she were trying to solve a puzzle that didn't fit together. Maya didn't answer. She couldn't. How could she explain something that even adults struggled to talk about? Blank. At home, her mother was careful to shield Maya from the growing storm. But she couldn't hide everything. Maya overheard snippets of phone calls, her mother's calm but determined voice speaking to school officials, local reporters, even a lawyer. Each conversation carried a sense of urgency, as though her mother was trying to protect Maya from something much larger than this single incident. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, her mother turned to her, her face serious but kind. Maya, she said gently, Miss Turner is organizing a meeting at the school. They want to talk about what happened and make sure it doesn't happen again. I think you should come. Maya's stomach twisted. The thought of standing in front of adults, of reliving the moment when everything had gone wrong, made her chest feel tight. Do I have to? She asked. Her voice small. Her mother hesitated, then shook her head. No, baby, you don't have to do anything you're not ready for. But I think it might help people understand what you went through. Maya didn't answer right away. She stared at her hands. The faint marks from the handcuffs long gone but still present in her memory. What if they don't believe me? She whispered. Her mother placed a hand over hers. Warm and steady. The truth doesn't need everyone to believe it, she said. It just needs someone brave enough to tell it. Blank. The meeting took place in the school auditorium, a space usually reserved for assemblies and holiday concerts. But tonight, the room felt different, quieter, heavier. Parents filled the folding chairs, their murmurs creating a low hum that seemed to echo off the walls. At the front of the room, Miss Turner stood beside a small podium, her calm presence doing little to mask the unease in the air. Maya sat beside her mother in the second row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She kept her eyes on the floor, avoiding the curious glances from the adults around her. When Miss Turner called her name, Maya hesitated. Her mother gave her a small nod of encouragement. And slowly, Maya stood, her legs trembling as she made her way to the front of the room. The silence that followed was deafening. She took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the room but not settling on any one face. I was walking home from school. She began, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. I wasn't doing anything wrong. The officer stopped me and said I looked suspicious. He put handcuffs on me and took me to the station. I didn't know why. The room remained silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Maya swallowed hard, her small hands gripping the edge of the podium. I'm not bad, she said, her voice trembling now. I didn't do anything. From the back of the room, someone cleared their throat, breaking the stillness. A man in a plaid shirt stood, his hands stuffed into his pockets. I'm sorry, he said, his voice quiet but clear. What happened to you? It wasn't right. One by one, others began to speak. Some offered words of support, their voices tinged with anger or sorrow. Others asked questions not to challenge her, but to understand, and while not everyone agreed, the conversation had begun. Blank. Underscore. Blank. When the meeting ended, Maya felt both exhausted and lighter. As she walked to the car with her mother, she glanced up at the stars overhead, their quiet presence a reminder of how small she felt in the world. But for the first time, she didn't feel invisible. The ripples of her story had started to spread, and while Maya didn't know where they would lead, she began to realize that even the smallest voices could make the water move. The days following the school meeting brought a kind of quiet Maya wasn't used to. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet, like a Sunday afternoon with her mother humming a tune in the kitchen. This was different, tense, unsettled, as though the town itself was holding its breath. People talked, of course, at the grocery store, in the church parking lot, over cups of coffee at the diner. Maya's name came up again and again. For some, she was a brave little girl who had stood up against something wrong. For others, she was a reminder of conversations they'd rather not have. The whispers followed Maya, even when she couldn't hear them. At school, some kids gave her space, their sideways glances filled with uncertainty. Others were bolder, their questions more pointed. Do you think he stopped you because you're different? A boy in her class asked one afternoon. His voice hushed but insistent. Maya didn't answer right away. She stared at her desk, her pencil frozen mid-doodle. Different. The word felt heavy, like a stone dropped into the middle of her chest. It wasn't the first time she'd heard it used that way, but it was the first time it seemed to carry so much weight. I don't know, she said finally, her voice barely audible, but deep down, she did know. She just wasn't sure how to say it. Blank. Underscore. Blank. At home, Maya's mother tried to shield her from the growing tension, but even her quiet strength couldn't block out everything. Letters arrived in the mail, some kind, filled with words of encouragement, while others were less so. The phone rang often, and while Maya couldn't hear both sides of the conversations, the tight lines around her mother's mouth told her enough. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, her mother turned to her with a look that was both soft and serious. Miss Turner called, she said. She said the police department is holding a meeting. They want to talk to the community about what happened and how to move forward. Maya frowned. Do I have to go? Her mother shook her head. No, baby, you don't have to do anything you're not ready for. But I think it's important for people to hear what you have to say. Maya thought about that for a long time. The idea of standing in front of so many people, of seeing Officer Thompson again, made her stomach twist. But there was a part of her, a small, steady part that wanted to be heard. Not for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt the way she did. I'll go, she said quietly. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The meeting was held in the town hall, a building Maya had only been inside once before on a school field trip. That day, it had seemed grand and important, with its high ceilings and rows of wooden benches. Tonight, it felt different, smaller, heavier. The room was packed. Faces Maya recognized from church and the grocery store sat alongside strangers. Their expressions a mix of curiosity, concern, and something else, something harder to define. At the front of the room, a panel of officials sat behind a long table. Officer Lopez was there, her presence a quiet anchor in the sea of unease. Beside her was the police chief, an older man with a lined face and a voice that carried even when he wasn't speaking. Maya sat with her mother near the back, her small hands gripping the edge of her chair. She had told herself she wouldn't be nervous. But her heart beat faster with each passing minute. When the meeting began, the police chief spoke first. He talked about community trust, and better training, and learning from mistakes. His words were calm, measured, but they didn't reach the room the way he seemed to hope they would. People listened, but their faces remained guarded. When Officer Lopez spoke, the tone shifted. Her words were simpler, less rehearsed. She talked about fairness, about listening, about seeing people as they were instead of as you assumed them to be. And when she mentioned Maya by name, heads turned, the weight of her story rippling through the room. Would you like to say something? Lopez asked gently, her eyes finding Maya in the crowd. Maya froze. Her mother squeezed her hand. A silent reminder that she didn't have to if she wasn't ready. But Maya knew she was. Standing was the hardest part. Her legs felt like they might give out beneath her as she made her way to the front. Every eye in the room fixed on her small frame. She climbed onto the step stool placed beside the microphone, her hands gripping the edges to steady herself. I didn't do anything wrong, she said, her voice trembling but clear. I was just walking home. The room was silent, her words hanging in the air like the echo of a bell. She looked out at the crowd, at the faces of people she had known all her life, and felt something shift inside her. I'm not bad, she said, her voice stronger now, but he looked at me like I was. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. The silence that followed was louder than any applause could have been. Blank. Blank. When the meeting ended, Maya and her mother walked home under the glow of streetlights. The air was cool, the quiet punctuated by the distant hum of crickets. Maya felt lighter somehow, as though she had left something behind in that room. Are you okay? Her mother asked. Her voice soft. Maya nodded. I think so. They walked in silence for a while before Maya spoke again. Do you think it will change anything? Her mother smiled. A small, knowing smile. Change doesn't happen all at once, she said. It's like planting a seed. You have to water it. Give it time, and hope it grows. Maya thought about that as they turned onto their street. The familiar sight of their house coming into view. Change was slow, maybe even invisible at first. But it had to start somewhere. And maybe, just maybe, it had started tonight. The days following the town hall meeting felt quieter, though the stillness carried a different kind of weight. For Maya, it wasn't the heavy silence of confusion or fear. This was something quieter, slower, like the faint rustle of leaves before a storm or the creak of a door slowly opening. At school, the whispers about her had faded, but they hadn't disappeared. Maya could still feel the stares, the sidelong glances from classmates who didn't know what to say. Some kids offered small smiles or kind words, though others kept their distance, unsure of how to approach her. It was as though her presence had become a reminder of something they couldn't quite name but felt all the same. Her teacher, Mrs. Parker, seemed more thoughtful than usual. During lessons, she would pause mid-sentence, as if choosing her words more carefully than before. One morning, she pulled Maya aside after class, her voice soft and measured. You're very brave, Maya, Mrs. Parker said, her eyes kind but searching. I know it's not easy to stand up and speak about what happened. Maya nodded, unsure how to respond. She didn't feel brave, not really. She had just told the truth, though the weight of it sometimes made her small shoulders ache. Blank. At home, life moved on as it always did, though Maya could sense the changes there too. Her mother was quieter, her movements slower, as though she were carrying a burden Maya couldn't see. Letters still came, some encouraging, others angry. Maya had asked about them once, but her mother had only shaken her head. People are complicated, her mother had said, folding one of the letters in half and setting it aside. Not everyone knows how to listen. Maya didn't press further. She didn't want to see the words that had made her mother's hands tremble. Blank. The weekend brought rain, a steady drizzle that blurred the edges of the world outside Maya's window. She sat curled up on the couch, a book open in her lap. Though she hadn't turned a page in what felt like hours, her thoughts drifted back to the town hall meeting, to the way the room had fallen silent when she spoke. I'm not bad, she had said. The words still echoed in her mind. A quiet reminder of the moment when her voice had finally been heard. But what had it changed? She wondered if Officer Thompson had heard her. If he had thought about what she said. She wondered if it had mattered to him at all. "Penny, for your thoughts," her mother said. Sitting down beside her, Maya looked up, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think he'll ever understand?" she asked quietly. Her mother didn't have to ask who she meant. She let out a slow breath. Her gaze distant. "Maybe," she said, "but understanding doesn't always come easy. Sometimes it takes time. And sometimes," she trailed off, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Sometimes people don't want to understand." Maya nodded, though the answer didn't satisfy her. She wanted to believe people could change. That they could see what was wrong and try to make it right. But the doubt lingered, like a shadow she couldn't shake. Blank. Underscore. Blank. On Monday morning, as Maya walked to school, she noticed something different. A group of adults stood near the corner where she had been stopped by Officer Thompson. Their signs, hand-painted and simple, carried messages that made her heart flutter with a mix of emotions. Justice for all. End discrimination. Children deserve better. Maya paused, her steps faltering. She recognized a few of the faces: neighbors, church members, people who had always seemed distant but now felt strangely close. One of them, a woman named Mrs. Alvarez, caught her eye and smiled. "You're an inspiration, Maya," she said, her voice warm despite the chilly morning air. "Thank you for speaking up." Maya didn't know what to say. She nodded, a small, shy smile forming on her lips before she continued walking. The signs and the people stayed with her, their presence a quiet but powerful reminder that her voice had reached more people than she realized. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Later that week, Miss Turner invited Maya to her office. The room, usually filled with the faint scent of coffee and paperwork, felt calmer than usual. Miss Turner smiled as Maya entered, motioning for her to sit. "I wanted to talk to you about something," Miss Turner began, folding her hands on the desk. "We're starting a new program at school, a way for students to talk about things that matter to them. It's called Voices for Change. I was wondering if you'd like to be part of it." Maya blinked, surprised. "Me? Yes, you," Miss Turner said with a small laugh. "You've shown us how important it is to listen, to really hear each other. I think you could help others find their voices too." Maya hesitated. The idea of standing in front of her classmates, of being a leader, felt overwhelming, but there was also a part of her, a quiet, growing part that wanted to say yes. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Miss Turner nodded. "Take your time. Just know that your voice matters, Maya, more than you know." Blank. Underscore. Blank. That evening, as Maya sat on the porch with her mother, she watched the sunset paint the sky in soft hues of pink and orange. The air was cool, the first hints of autumn creeping in. She thought about Miss Turner's words, about the people on the corner with their signs, about everything that had happened since that ordinary Tuesday afternoon. "Do you think I can really help people?" Maya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother looked at her, her eyes soft with pride. "You already have," she said, "and you'll keep helping, just by being who you are." Maya didn't respond right away. She let the words settle over her, warm and steady like her mother's hand on her shoulder. The shadows of doubt were still there, but they didn't feel as heavy anymore. For the first time in weeks, Maya felt a flicker of something she hadn't expected: hope. Not the loud, shouting kind, but the quiet, steady kind that could grow stronger with time. Change was slow, she realized, but even the smallest voices could make the biggest ripples. And maybe, just maybe, her voice was one of them. The seasons had begun to change in Clearwater. The summer heat had given way to the crisp, gentle embrace of autumn, and the trees that lined Maya's street were ablaze with color. It was the kind of change you could see, feel, and breathe. But the changes happening beneath the surface of the town were harder to name. They were quieter, less obvious, but no less real. Maya walked home from school one afternoon, her backpack bouncing lightly against her shoulders. The route was familiar, but it no longer felt the same. Every step reminded her of the day everything changed, of the moment that had altered not just her life, but how she saw the world. At the corner where Officer Thompson had stopped her, the street was quiet. There were no protesters now. No signs. No stares. Just the rustle of leaves as the wind carried them across the sidewalk. And yet, the memory lingered, not as a wound, but as a reminder, a scar that told a story. Blank. Underscore. Blank. That evening, Maya's mother handed her a letter as they sat at the kitchen table. The envelope was plain, but the official seal in the corner caught Maya's eye. She glanced at her mother, who gave her an encouraging nod. Maya opened the letter carefully, her fingers trembling just slightly. The words inside were simple, yet they carried a weight that made her chest tighten. Dear Maya, we are writing to formally acknowledge the events of recent months and to express our commitment to ensuring that what happened to you will not happen again. Your courage in speaking out has inspired changes within our department, including mandatory training and a review of our community engagement practices. Thank you for your bravery and your willingness to help us learn and grow. Sincerely, Chief Gregory Brown, Clearwater Police Department, **. Maya read the letter twice, the words sinking in slowly. She looked up at her mother, unsure of what to feel. Does this mean it's over? She asked quietly. Her mother smiled, her eyes soft. It means they're listening, she said, and that's a good place to start. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The following week, Maya stood in front of her class for the first meeting of Voices for Change. The room was small, the desks arranged in a loose circle, but it felt larger than any space she'd ever been in. Her classmates sat quietly, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Maya took a deep breath. I know some of you might think I don't belong here, she began, her voice steady but soft. Or that what happened to me doesn't matter. But it does. Not just because it was wrong, but because it's not just my story. She paused, looking around the room. It's about all of us. About how we treat each other. About what we see when we look at someone. And I think, if we can talk about that, maybe we can make things better. The room was silent for a moment. Then a boy in the back raised his hand. How do we even start? He asked. Maya smiled, the kind of smile that came from understanding something deep and true. By listening, she said, and by trying. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Outside the school, the world moved on. Parents picked up their kids. Cars hummed down the street. And the scent of fallen leaves lingered in the air. But inside that small classroom, something was beginning, a conversation that Maya hoped would grow. Like a seed planted in fertile ground. Blank. Underscore. Blank. On the walk home, Maya passed by a familiar face. Officer Lopez stood by her patrol car, chatting with a group of kids from the neighborhood. She glanced up as Maya approached, her face breaking into a warm smile. Hey there, Maya, Lopez said. How's the new program going? It's going, Maya replied, her voice light. I think it's a good start. Lopez nodded, her expression thoughtful. Good starts are important, she said, but remember, it's what you do next that matters most. Maya smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. I will, she said. Blank. Underscore. Blank. That night, as Maya sat on the porch with her mother, the sky stretched wide above them, dotted with stars. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from a distant chimney. Maya wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, her thoughts quiet but full. Do you think things will really change? She asked, her voice soft. Her mother didn't answer right away. She looked out at the darkened street, her gaze thoughtful. Change isn't always big, she said finally. Sometimes it's small. It's in the way people think, the way they talk, the way they choose to act. And sometimes, it takes a long time. But it's there, even if you can't always see it. Maya nodded, her heart settling into a quiet rhythm. She thought about the letter, the meeting at school, the kids who had listened to her story. They were small things, maybe, but they were hers. They were the seeds she had planted. And she was ready to see what they might grow into. The stars above seemed brighter somehow, as though they were leaning in to listen. And as Maya leaned back into her mother's warmth, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, not loud or flashy, but steady and sure, like the quiet glow of a light that never goes out.